Hello and welcome back to Marie's Mindful Makes. Today we're going to talk about vintage knitting, which I am so excited about because vintage knitting or the vintage knit silhouette is what originally got me into starting to knit. And for this episode today, we're going to travel to the 1940s in Great Britain more specifically, but luckily, of course, only figuratively, because let's face it, the 1940s were a terrible time in European history. And no matter how you look at it, and no matter how much you love that sleek 1940s vintage silhouette, there is no way of denying or ignoring the horrors of National Socialist fascism in Europe at the time, World War II, and all of that. And I think it is really important to talk about this historical context when we're talking about the time, the clothes that came out of that time. When we're talking about knitwear, 1940s, Great Britain, we're obviously going to talk about make, do and mend. And especially with the Make, Do and Mend campaign, I observe in today's discussion of it quite often a little bit of a romanticizing of that period, going into the direction of, oh, people back then were so thrifty and so creative, and just look at this careful use of resources and all of that. And I agree, yes. The clothing from that era, the patterns that come out of that era is very inspiring. The skill of people, fantastic. But also, people had no choice. They were living through World War II. There was resource scarcity everywhere. And I just think that that is something that we shouldn't forget. But before we get too serious, make sure you grab something to keep yourself occupied while listening. Maybe get yourself a nice little drink and let's get started. Today I'm wearing the Make Do jumper, a patron pattern by Sydney Crabo. Sydney recreated this pattern after an original exhibit she saw in an Edinburgh museum. Sydney's patterns at Squid School of Vintage Knitting, a patron subscription, are based upon some math with your own body measurements, so every piece is made to measure and naturally fits like a glove. My measurements are 85 centimeters in the bust, plus 2.5 centimeter positive ease for this garment, and 60 centimeter in the waist with 0 ease. This is a Stash Buster Deluxe project because it plays with odd skeins and leftover yarn in your stash in true make, do and mend fashion. It uses fingering weight, of which I chose 5 colors plus 1 extra in the ribbing. Now that you had a better look at my fabulous make, do and mend, or my make, do jumper, let's talk about make, do and mend a little bit more in detail. If you are into vintage knitting, you might be very familiar with the Make, Do and Mend campaign. Similarly, if you care about slow fashion, fashion revolution, and all of these things. But for everyone who's never heard of it, let's do a very quick overview of its history. Make, Do and Mend was a public campaign in Great Britain introduced in 1943 as a reaction to clothes rationing and resource scarcity during World War II. So let's quickly take some steps back to really get the full picture of the history we're talking about here. World War II was started by Nazi Germany in 1939 with the invasion of Poland on September 1st. September 3rd, Great Britain and France entered into the war, fulfilling an agreement with Poland. Of course, this war did not happen just out of nowhere. The National Socialist regime had been in power in Germany since 1933 after the appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor by then President Hindenburg. From the very beginning, the authoritarian and fascist ideology of the National Socialists had been very clear, very pronounced. Nonetheless, especially after the Great Depression and the social and economic implications of that for many people in Germany, they had really gained a lot of popular support. In the beginning of the National Socialists gaining power, there was, however, still political unrest and resistance, but the Nazis were very, very quick on cutting down on any resistance. And sometimes in today's Germany, people can be very quick to find resisting family members in their own lineage, but the fact is that a very, 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 very small minority actually had the courage to actively fight against the National Socialist regime in Germany. Within Germany, the National Socialists had begun with the persecution of opponents and anyone who didn't fall into their racist and fascist ideology very quickly after gaining power. Their anti-Semitism, which was out there from the very beginning, became very clearly verbalized in the Nuremberg Laws in 1938. And the National Socialist ideology was really something that had a very, very strong foothold across the society in Germany. So chances are, if you see pictures, and I'm just making this very randomly up right now, if you see pictures of two fashionable young ladies strolling through Berlin in 1936, chances are those, at least in parts, aligned very strongly with the National Socialist ideology, and that those two ladies were anti-Semites. In fact, even by at least today's standards, some of the most fashionable Germans at the time were pronounced and proud National Socialists, such as the suit and workwear brand Hugo Boss, which remains very popular to this day and was one of the main producers of uniforms for the National Socialists. And I mean, even beyond German borders, Coco Chanel is one of these examples of a anti-Semite who is very successful in the fashion world, especially after World War II. With the German invasion of first Poland and then many other European states, concentration camps, death camps were established across Europe. And during the Holocaust, 6 million Jewish people, about 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe, were killed by the National Socialists and collaborators. World War II ended in Europe in May 1945 with the liberation of occupied territories and of Germany through the Allied forces, at that time then being France, Great Britain, the United States of America, and the Soviet Union. Today's focus in this episode is on Great Britain and, as I said before, on the Make, Do and Mend campaign. With Britain entering the war, raw materials, fabrics, cloth and all of that was needed for the war industry, and it quite quickly became a scarce resource. So with shortage arising quite quickly, cloth rationing was introduced in 1941, and that rationing also included wool. The British government regulated civilian clothing production, like for example how many buttons were allowed in a garment and what kind of fits, etc. Were appropriate for civilian clothing. At the same time, the government introduced the Make, Do and Mend scheme for private home sewing and clothing production in 1942. The Board of Trade distributed leaflets and posters and flyers to private households. There was also an animated TV character, Mrs. So-and-so, adorable but also slightly terrifying, if you ask me. And all of this was meant to educate people on how to be more thrifty, how to repair clothing, how to mend clothing, how to work with what you have at home, and to inspire creativity in those times of scarcity. Very quick side note here. I wish the European Union would support its new EU repairability law with a Mrs. So and so or with a Mrs. Repair, just to inspire people. How cool is that? And how catchy, right? So I think that's where we can see very clearly why this scheme overall could be very appealing to people nowadays who try to encourage a more mindful approach to clothing. I mean, this is includes myself, being more resourceful, more caring, and trying to educate people again on long lost skills such as sewing on a button or fixing a hole in your socks or something like that. In addition to those government campaigns in Great Britain, women's groups and the Women's Voluntary Service also organized meetups, both to exchange knowledge or to organize workshops and trainings, but also to organize clothes swaps, for example, for children's clothes or for school uniforms, and just in general get-togethers centered on this whole topic of garment production, reproduction, upcycling, etc. And I think that's another thing where we can see the appeal for today's sustainable clothing movement. But then at the same time, Make, Do and Mend also had a very strong propagandesque element. And of course, and I think that's the most important thing to consider, is that it simply wasn't really a choice. It's great that such a scheme was introduced, not only to inspire, but also to lift morale among homemakers and to provide an outlet for creativity in really, really, really tough times. But it's really difficult to, in my opinion, come today and say, wow, so inspiring. Those people had so little and they made so much from it. Because that is very clearly romanticizing the suffering of people during times of war. I find it very interesting to reflect on the contrast that we can sometimes see, where you have those really colorful and intrinsic special garments and patterns coming out of that time, while then also being aware of just how terrifying it must have been living through that time. Those colorful knit garments and patterns can easily have us forget the horrific historical setting they were originally set in. But as you can tell from my outfit, I don't say no to knit patterns from that period, not at all. I just think it's important to not romanticize that era and to really make a conscious effort to educate ourselves on the time and the historical context that something comes from that we appreciate today. This relates specifically to World War II and everything that happened in the 1930s and 1940s. But I think it also connects to a lot of other issues of social and cultural interaction and political realities. There are so many angles to look at if we're starting to dig deeper into the historical, social, political, cultural realities of the vintage garments and styles we love today. One thing that I quickly want to mention towards the end of this episode is that what most of these garments have in common is that they're very often produced, or were very often produced, by women. When we look at vintage garments, we most often look at women's work, women's art, and their absolutely impeccable skill, which has and continues to be very often been overlooked in the storytelling of our historical past. Besides everything other terrible that happened in the 1930s and 1940s, the era also saw a really great backlash against women's rights and the feminist gains of the 1920s. And when we look at images of women from the World War II era, this very often we have this image in our mind of Josie Riveter and of all the women who filled in the empty spots of the men who went into war. But that was just a very momentary occurrence. And then after the war, when the men returned, those women were again pushed out of these positions. And in the 1950s, we can see a really, really strong retraditionalization of gender roles, which had already started during the war, even if the actual reality at that time didn't allow for more traditional gender role, because workforce was needed in countries where so many men had been going into war and were dying in war. For me, when it comes to vintage and retrofits, it's especially the looks from the 1930s through the 1950s which appeal to me the most. Late 1950s, early 1960s is also something I can get on board with, where things slowly start to change in terms of emancipation and all of that. But I have to admit that for the longest time, I struggled a little bit to wear those garments with a clear conscience. At this point today, I say there's nothing to worry about, but it still should be everyone's responsibility to, as I said before, just educate yourself and have a little bit awareness about the historical context of the era or period when those clothes were originally designed. There is so much to love about vintage style, but so little to romanticize about vintage values. And I say that from the bottom of my heart as an independent woman who is just so happy that I don't have to live through the patriarchal shit of the 1950s. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this history lesson. The pattern that you just saw, the sock pattern, is, by the way, another Sydney Crebeau pattern, another design that she has published through her Patreon subscription, Squid School of Vintage Knitting, which, if you are at all into vintage knitting or want to learn more about the history of knitting, I can recommend so much. I've been part of a Patreon for a few years now, and she just keeps giving. I have learned so much. I love her history lessons that come out monthly, and yeah, it's a great recommendation for you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for tuning in today, for joining me today. I hope you learned something. Maybe it inspired you to browse some vintage patterns, draw some inspiration for them, or to maybe go into your stash and see what colors you can bring together for some colorful and resourceful garments. Until next time, goodbye.